One very common complaint is nobody likes me. Other versions of that include I keep finding myself with toxic people aren't buying what I'm selling, no one will hire me, and things like that. Any of us who find ourselves unattractive to other people in some way suffer from the blow to our self-esteem, as well as not having the kinds of social relationships and professional engagement that we want. The good news is that we can change that so long as we face the reality of the situation. We can actually make ourselves more attractive and more valuable to others. We can do this without permission or encouragement from others. In fact, the only encouragement we really need is that original rejection. It's normal for rejection to make us feel inadequate. That is the failure signal that's being sent to us when we can't hang out with the people we want to because they won't return our calls, or we can't go to work in the places we want to because we won't get hired. But that decrease in enthusiasm and vitality that usually gets triggered when we feel rejected, when we are rejected, that decrease in vitality only serves to make the problem worse. So while it's normal and average and understandable and forgivable, we need to eventually get over it. When life is at its worst, it needs us at our best. That can be challenging because our normal response to bad news is to become dejected. However, it's not the only option, and we can recruit help from others, reminders like this recording, and just recognize that we can respond to criticism and rejection and failure with renewed enthusiasm. In fact, we can't afford to wallow in self-pity for any longer than is necessary. This is a kind of tough love message delivered in as gentle and reassuring of a way as possible to remind you and myself that we still have time. When they say time is money, that means that we can turn our time into money so long as we're in a position to do something for someone else that they value, which means that we are valuable and useful to them. You can even think of it as wanting to be used and rewarded for your usefulness. I personally have a lot of experience with self-pity. Even when things have gone really well for me in life, I've suffered from imposter syndrome, and since I didn't deal with that adequately in time, it actually came back to bite me. That's why I'm recording this for myself and for you, because it's so tempting to crawl into a hole physically, emotionally, mentally, and psychospiritually when things are not going well around us. It can be tempting to stay in that hole because of being afraid of rejection and feeling hopeless after receiving some bad news. However, the world needs us. We need ourselves. And each one of us has the capacity, in principle, to make someone else's day. Helping others and being rewarded for it is the way out of the suffering associated with being rejected. When we can start to be welcoming of rejection, because we recognize that it's information that's useful, then we start to become unstoppable and limitless. Our ego is by definition stoppable and limited. When we identify with our ego or with ourself, that's when fear, anxiety, resentment, and bitterness start to become very likely feelings that we experience when we are exposed to loss, suffering, uncertainty. The acronym Meet God applies here. It stands for Make Enlightenment Easy through Gifts of Desperation. We all know stories about people who were desperate and started praying to God in their desperation. And that's totally normal, because until we feel like we need help from the outside, it's common, it's very likely that we feel arrogant, self-assured, like we can handle things ourselves. But when life becomes unmanageable, it's natural that we would turn to a higher power. And meeting God, when you say meet God, make enlightenment easy through gifts of desperation, it just means recognizing and acknowledging that life has gotten out of hand and we can't handle it. The giving up or surrendering or submitting that happens at that moment is exactly the right move. We say, hey, it is what it is. Things happen. I'm not special in that way that things shouldn't happen to me or that I should be exempt from adversity. Then we remember that, in fact, adversity, if approached in the right way, can actually lead to growth. Adversity is synonymous with being outside of our comfort zone. And when we're outside of our comfort zone, we are in our growth zone. Of course, the ego does not like being in the growth zone, especially if it's a relatively weak, sensitive, insecure, fragile ego. But over time, as life continues to give us wake-up calls in the form of rejection, in the form of failure, we can start to get over ourselves, which means not to get rid of ourselves, but to start to wield and to tame and to harness our ego. The ego or the self is a great servant, but a terrible master. Our birthright in life is to be the master of ourselves, to be the master of our lives. Failure and rejection serve to show us the limitations of our current level of mastery. When we get rejected and then we feel depressed, it shows us that we don't have control over our emotions, don't have control over our conditions. And if we listen closely, we can also hear our heart telling us that it wants to have control, to have contribution, to be an authority, to have authorship over how things turn out in our lives. This is a natural impulse to want to not be a slave or a puppet or a non-player character in our own lives. We have the birthright and the instinctual drive to be the main characters in our lives. And what we've been discussing the past 10 minutes is exactly the path to move from being at the mercy of conditions, for instance, being depressed on the other side of rejection, to being the master of conditions, which starts with first being okay with how things are, coming to peace with rejection and failure, forgiving other people for not liking us the way we are, and forgiving ourselves for not being attractive. From then, with the energy that's restored to us when we let go of that resentment and bitterness, we can double down on that realization that we're still growing, this discomfort is serving us, and therefore it makes sense to be grateful for the feedback that we get, even if it hurts our ego in the short term.